life on the medieval margins. And yeah, I'm delighted to be able to hand over to Blair Apgar, who will be chairing the session.
Great, thank you. Oh, great, here's Michelle. Yeah, great. This is our panel on life on the medieval margins. Our panelists today are M Sauer, Owen Goddard, and Thom Gobbitt, who will all be shifting us kind of away from the conventional portrayals of monstrous outsiders. And instead, we're going to examine the experiences of individuals who've been, in some ways, kind of positioned on the peripheries of medieval societies. Our panelists are going to consider how aspects such as social class, law, and identity, among other attributes, pushed people to the fringes of society. And they'll share their different perspectives, ranging from practical game development to academic research on how these sorts of marginalizations manifested in modern games. We'll hear about 10 to 15 minutes from each speaker, and then we'll launch into a larger discussion between the panelists and the audience. With that, our first speaker is Michelle M. Sauer, who is a Chester Fritz Distinguished Professor of English at the University of North Dakota. She is a medievalist who specializes in early Christian devotional literature, gender and queer theory, and critical race studies. She's also one of the founding members of an organization called Medievalists of Color, whose mission is to counteract the inherent whiteness of representations in the Middle Ages. She's currently working on a number of collections on materiality, critical race theory and religion, as well as the history of sexuality. She's also working on a monograph about the solitary sexuality involving religiously enclosed peoples, including issues like monastic masturbation, which is just such a delightful phrase. She enjoys playing video games, particularly fantasy setting games such as RPGs set in medieval-esque worlds, and is particularly interested in the relationship between medieval stereotypes and the Victorian conceptions of the era. Michelle, whenever you're ready.
Michelle, you'll need to walk to that chair spot on the right-hand side, and that will put you into broadcast. Okay, yeah, now you're in broadcast mode. Yeah, great.
Okay, sorry. Obviously, I'm really bad at this sort of thing, but it's very cute. I love the setup. It's very cute. And I was thrilled. I was excited to have somebody about a video game conference ask me to talk about the real Middle Ages, because I grew up in the 80s and the I guess high times of video games. I used to go to the arcade with piles of quarters. I still have a working Atari 2600 at home. So my husband and I collect video games. We have many of the systems. Never have had a Wii, and I don't have one of those early Commodores. Those are about the only ones I don't have. So what can I say? So I guess one of the first things I thought of when asked to do this was about some of the controversies in fantasy as a larger whole. So I'm a huge Star Trek fan, like a huge Star Trek fan, and except I don't count any of the J.J. Abrams stuff. That's anathema. But I remember in the early 90s, one of the very first fantasy controversies that I actively remember taking part in. I kind of grew up a little bit activist, I have to admit. I was raised by, I'm only half white, and I was raised by two women in Fargo, North Dakota, so I kind of always been marginalized myself, so I'm kind of into these controversies. But Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager was the first Black Vulcan in the series, or so everybody said. It's not really true, because there are several Vulcans of color, if you want to call them that, in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan at the end. Star Trek 3, also like at the scene in when the Kal Torfan is happening and Spock's Katra is being returned. But the controversy over Tuvok was huge for the time. If you look back, it really wasn't as big as the blow up, say, over the Black Elves in the Tolkien series Rings of Power. It's still controversial, even though the second season isn't even out. Or the mermaid controversy with Halle Berry. Besides the obvious that it's kind of weird that people are that deeply invested in characters that don't exist, what's the deal? I mean, and I think the deal is that fantasy, and I know science fiction in Star Trek isn't medieval per se, but there is a holdover from the idea of fantasy, which many people see as being born from Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, as being a very, very white space. Part of that is, I have to say, Tolkien was a medievalist, a professional medievalist. There is still a Tolkien chair and it's unfortunately still called Anglo-Saxon Studies at Oxford. He was a philologist, which is someone who specifically studies historical linguistics. In fact, Elvish in Lord of the Rings is Old Finnish with some twists. And Tolkien was racist. I mean, let's just say it straight out. I remember the first time I read Tolkien, I was in 4th grade, and I'm Indian. And I was like, wait a minute, when we get to the scene with the people of the elephants, I was like, this isn't right. I didn't realize that he was from South Africa, and participated in the war. And so that all of that sort of goes to his scenario. So he did set up fantasy as a very white space. And I think fantasy books and then video games based on them remained a very white space. Yet people were hesitant to talk about the Middle Ages or academically talk about medieval studies as a place where race even mattered. To this day, there are a lot of people who will say there is no such thing as race in the Middle Ages, that it's only religious difference that matters. That is not true. Religious differences matter a lot, but race and race studies is actually constructed in the Middle Ages. One of the main scholars in this area is Geraldine Heng. And she wrote a book called The Invention of Race in the Middle Ages that has swept medieval studies and really kind of kicked off a whole sort of thing in our discipline. I did say earlier that there's a Tolkien chair, unfortunately, still of Anglo-Saxon studies. One of the major controversies, for an example, has been what we do with the term Anglo-Saxon. It's not a term that the people of early England applied to themselves. They did call themselves Angles or Saxons, and that term was used a couple of times by French people, but the people of early England themselves they didn't even call themselves English. The term is an invention of post-Renaissance scholarship that was looking to purify England, its religion and its language, to scour away any traces first of papism, so of Roman Catholicism. And then as the time went along into the 17th and 18th centuries, to purify the language itself, reclaim it as a white space. I know it sounds crazy that people were thinking about this stuff then, but it's absolutely true. And in fact, I just taught this in my history of the English language class last week. There was something in the late 1700s called the Great Sanskrit Shock. Sir William Jones, who would have called himself an Orientalist, but as an Indian, I would call him a big colonialist, who was one of the governors of India, suffering under English oppression. Taught himself Sanskrit with the help of an impoverished scholar, since the Brahmins refused to teach him Sanskrit. It is a holy language, and they didn't want their colonizer to have access to it. He did something called comparative reconstruction to go back and figure out where Germanic languages came from. English is a Germanic language. To his shock and horror, he discovered that there was a language called Proto-Indo-European that spawned most of the languages in Europe, including Latin and Greek, and all the Germanic languages like English. It was controversial, and from it spawned a number of movements to try to purify and reclaim English as a white language, including the Aryan movement. So that traces all the way back to that. But let's maybe take a step back. I'm going to be bad at time, so somebody will have to tell me. But let me take a step back and say that I want to get a few examples in, and then I have other things I can talk about later. But I definitely want to say that I'm trying to use the big examples. So Chaucer, for an example. If I sound like I'm skipping around, I'm like, oh, I don't want to miss these examples. I apologize. There is one of the Canterbury Pilgrims, the Canterbury Tales, is Chaucer's big frame narrative that's rather famous. It was a medieval bestseller, so it would have been read aloud a lot. It was also one of the first printed books, and there are many editions of it. One of the pilgrims for sure is Black. His name is Perkin Revelure, and he is an apprentice cook in the Chaucer's Cook's Tale. He is described as brown as a berry, a proper short fellow with black locks combed elegantly. This is a racialized brownness. But the problem is that the white gaze is so embedded that scholars tend to see darker skin as evidence maybe of disease or a low social class, or just overwork in the sun, rather than him being a Black person. To back this up, there have been a couple, and one forthcoming, in fact, of osteological data that studied cemeteries in medieval England. And I'm just going to summarize the results there. In East Smithfield Cemetery, for an example, the bones were determined, and of course there is some slippage, but I mean, generally anthropology can sort of classify bones. 1% of the people in that cemetery were Asian, 13% of them were Black, 80% were white, and 6% is indeterminate. Is that a high proportion of white people? Absolutely. It was England in the Middle Ages. Is that a pretty high percentage of Black people in medieval England? Yeah. Even 1% of Asian people is actually fairly high in medieval England. People can travel, but it takes an extensive amount of planning, time, and investment. What else do we see around cemeteries in England? Well, where studies have been done, we kind of get an overall Black population of anywhere from 5 to 20%, depending on the location. Large urban and trade centers like London and Canterbury and York, of all places, have more racial diversity. Overall, the Asian population was anywhere from 1% to 5%. What has really happened is that there's a white imaginary in relationship to medieval England, but also medieval Europe as a whole, across the board, which then I think extends to fantasy worlds such as video games and fantasy novels, and even just general popular culture. If you think about movies based on the European Middle Ages, there are all kinds of imaginary problems, I would say. So if we then, I gotta be close to the end here. If we then talk about it, the history of medieval Europe, we do have to take into account that both race and racism were present in medieval Europe, and the scholarship now really has to take account for that. I think I'll just pause, and I can answer lots of questions later. I don't want to take other people's time, so.
Michelle, if you'd like to keep going, you still have about 4 minutes till you're at 15.
Do I? I'm really bad at telling time.
That's okay. That's why I'm here.
Thank you. Well, okay, I can talk about that. So the exclusion of the medieval period from the history of race issues, I think it generally derives from an understanding of race that has been overly influenced by the era of scientific racism. It starts with the so-called Age of Enlightenment, when science was the beginning of racial classification. Now, it comes into being with Sir William Jones and the Sanskrit shot, but it goes forward as the social sciences are developed as disciplines, particularly anthropology. This is I mean no offense to modern anthropologists, they are fully aware of the history of their discipline, but anthropology as a discipline was generally invented to prove that the white race was superior. That's why they started doing things like phrenology, studying the bumps on your head, and measuring heads, measuring skulls, looking for things then to prove and maintain white superiority. But if we think about a larger understanding of race, race is one of the primary names we have, a name that we retain for the commitments that it recognizes, that is attached to a repeating tendency of the gravest import to demarcate human beings through differences among humans that are then selectively identified as absolute and fundamental, so as distribute positions and powers differentially to human groups. So in race making, strategic essentialisms are posited and assigned through a variety of practices. Thus, race becomes a structural relationship for the management of human differences rather than a substantive content. What this does then is, instead of opposing pre-modern prejudice to modern racisms, we can see the treatment of, say, medieval Jews and medieval Ethiopians, including legalized murder and that sort of thing, as racial acts. Today, we might call those hate crimes. If I then pivot just a little bit to other areas of marginalization, I study a lot of the history of sexuality. Were there people marginalized just like people of color in the Middle Ages because of their sexual preferences, their sexual practices, their sexual identities? I mean, yes. The thing is, there wasn't a concept of a sexual identity that no one would have identified as, I am a homosexual. But there were certainly people who participated in those acts and participated in that lifestyle to some extent. There is an academic or theoretical concept called compulsive heterosexuality, and that was pretty fundamentally applied across the pre-modern world. Even in Greece, which is sort of famous for its same-sex relationships, compulsive heterosexuality meant that the majority of people were married, or in Christianity, in a monastic culture, even if their sexual orientation was towards same-sex relationships, because the family, the heterosexual nuclear family, was the basis of political structures and economic structures as well. But we do have evidence, just like we have evidence of Black people and brown people and Asian people living in white spaces, we have evidence of, say, trans people who lived in the Middle Ages as fluid gender. For example, there was a person named Eleanor Reichner, or John Reichner, who went on trial for dressing as both a man and a woman and having sex with both men and women. And in their testimony, they stated that they preferred to be called Eleanor, even though the birth name was John. So, I mean, we do have evidence also of those kinds of marginalized people as well. Women, well, that's a whole separate discussion. Women were just marginalized in general, according to all three of the major religions in medieval Europe, as well as all of the major political systems. Now I certainly must be at the edge of my tongue.
Yep, just come to it. That's great. Thank you, Michelle. That was really very fascinating. I'm really excited to get into the questions. Our next speaker is going to be Owen Goddard. Owen is a solo hobbyist developer from the United Kingdom. His current project, Under the Yoke, is a multi-generational medieval life sim told from the perspective of a family of peasants from 1085 to 1335 as they strike out a living in medieval England. The game intentionally centers the lives of everyday people as they navigate the oppressive feudal system of the period. Throughout Under the Yoke are player choice moments designed to reveal the conditions of those who are cast to the margins of society, whether it be by their occupation, religious affiliation, or health, among other factors. Owen, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm willing to donate my 15 minutes to Michelle if you want. I'm not a historian. I'm a indie developer, so more of a hobbyist historian and hobbyist developer. So nothing of anything really. But for Under the Yoke, the focus is primarily on medieval peasants, which are already, they are a marginal community in the sense of they made up the lower strata of society. So the vast majority of people fell into this grouping of agricultural subsistence workers. So through my research, obviously it's quite hard to find information about this lower strata. The nobles and the religious communities were much more interested in writing about themselves than they were the everyday people. So quite a lot of the research comes from sources like courts, so court documents and bits like that. But the thing that I found interesting and I really wanted to talk about during this talk was primarily while that is a lower strata of society, there is very specifically Western medieval feudal Europe. This is not a global generalization, but there existed a lower class of society in the sense of there were people that weren't bound to the land. There were wandering laborers and strangers and groups like charcoalers who used to be considered with a great deal of animosity and any sort of stranger or outside of the group, because I imagine in some part you lived in a community your whole life. When you have people coming into that community that you're not familiar with, it can be quite difficult to want to even trust those sorts of people. But the difficulty that I had with Under the Yoke was finding out anything to do with these people, because frankly they're written about in such third person, sort of as an aside to another aside. Legal cases, they had mentions of peasants that had been too kind to strangers that were passing through the village and were being sort of brought up for that, not necessarily on charges, but more of a scolding, maybe a fine. So actually finding first person sources from the perspective of those people, I imagine for me was impossible. I imagine for proper historians they might have a better chance. But I was interested in how we represent this sort of underclass, in the sense of it's fascinating in its own right. I can't think, obviously the world isn't a fantastic place today, but I can't think of a group that is that far marginalized and that far ostracized that even interacting with them can get you in trouble. So I think it's interesting to portray those groups, and then B, in the context of Under the Yoke, I think I shared in my message, I think I've somewhat failed in being able to represent just how marginalized these groups were. So in Under the Yoke, we have a system, an event system, where you've got these pre-written events that randomly pop up, and they tell you a little bit about the world, and they say, how do you want to react to this situation? And that's really the only way we've been able to represent these marginalized people. And the breadth of ways people become marginalized. I mean, I've discussed occupation, obviously, so not having an occupation, first of all, is problematic. But certain jobs, charcoalers, I don't think Tanner's had a very nice time, but I imagine they could do quite well. But then you've got people that are marginalized on account of disease. So you had lepers, obviously, were forced to live in their own communities. There are leper colonies sort of on the outskirts of towns. People were afraid of touching them. So they were incredibly ostracized. Then you've got people from different religious communities. So Jews obviously had a very hard time in the medieval period. England exiled them, I think, at least a couple of times at certain points. You've got people with different sexual orientations. So obviously in the medieval period and in the period that I'm discussing, that's an incredible amount of trouble to get into if you were found to be not of the norm, I suppose you'd say. So I guess it's a matter of representing those differences and how that can best be covered. I don't think I've come into this conversation with the same weaponry as my other panelists, but I thought it was an interesting discussion to have and sort of share the findings that I've had so far. How am I doing for time? Because I don't want to ramble on.
You're doing okay. Yeah, you got time. Don't worry.
Cool. Dan.
You can go about till 11:39 or till 39 past, I should say.
Okay, cool. All right, so I've been going 5 minutes. Good. Yeah. So the Dan falling apart here. Yeah, the difficulty I see is having those primary sources. So being able to talk about these things in a way that accurately reflects the struggles of the people at the time, as well as making that interesting for the player. You know, there is a certain amount of why should I care, and I think it's for the sort of games I develop, they are meant to be for historically nerdy people. I'm as I say, I'm not a historian, so I can only ever do as much as I can do. But I wonder, for a more broad audience, how do you represent these really fascinating and hopefully for most people quite alien ideas of people that aren't on the inside of society. So I think I've run out of time. I'm sorry. I've run out of things to say, not out of time. I'm struggling a little bit.
That's okay. We can always move on, and then we'll have I've
let me get on
questions for you later. Yeah,
Thanks.
That's great. Right. Brilliant. We will move on then to our final speaker, Thom Gobbitt. Thom is an early medievalist whose research focus stands at the intersection of the history of law and the history of the book, and who is steadily expanding into ludology. On the gaming front, he is currently editing a collected volume of chapters on the representation of the medieval past in analog or tabletop games, and is currently preparing a fantastic TTRPG game based on the 7th century Lombard laws in the Edictus Rothari of 643 CE. Thom is also a part-time postdoctoral researcher on the ERC Present Dead project in the Austrian Academy of the Sciences in Vienna, which explores grave reopenings and human interactions with materials relating to the dead from the 5th to the 8th centuries. Thom, whenever you're ready.
Oh, thank you very much for the very kind introduction and adding in the word fantastic about the game. I guess the playtest last July went well and left an impression.
Oh, yes, it's brilliant.
Excellent, fantastic. Right, I am going to attempt to share screen and get some slides on. I'm afraid I don't have very much in the way of pretty pictures, but I do have blocks of text that hopefully people can read while I point at the key bits, so we can all be distracted. Let's see if this will work. So screen share, and I want that one. So let's see if this works. Has that worked? And slideshow from the beginning. Can you see a slide, or has that worked? Yep.
Yes, I can see it.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful. So I promised to talk about liminal places and magical people within the Lombard laws, which is a huge, huge subject. So allow me to do what is traditional amongst academics and shrink down the subject very slightly to look at two very specific types of people that are named within the law, the areolus and the areola, which are two gendered versions of basically the same profession. So these occupations, roles, people, criminals, whatever you want to call them, are named in two laws issued by the Lombard king Luitprand in the year 727. They are, for me, they're some of the most interesting laws that that we've got in there. And as was mentioned just now, with my Langobard RPG, I based that in the 7th century laws, the first written phase of the laws issued in 643. So this is like 80 years later, and I'm like, do I extend the focus of my game so that I can include these laws in here as well? This has been one of the recurring concerns for me, because everything that, you know, I put a time limit on so to make it manageable. And everything that happened later, I want to squeeze in. I'm sure that this over-consumption approach to our source materials and potential source materials is a problem that everybody is well aware of, whether coming from a gaming side or from a historian and just wanting to study things side. But basically, within this particular law, and I'm not, like I said, not going to give too much background, the law basically addresses the legal processes and frameworks relating to what we might call private individuals in the modern day, enslaved people, and to legal officials in how they interact with these two somewhat mysterious areolus and areola, which of course brings us to the question, what do these terms actually mean? Anybody who recognises this gets bonus points from me instantly. If we were to read the modern English translation of the Lombard laws published in the 1970s, we would see areolus and areola just quietly translated to sorcerer for the male version, areolus, and witch for the female version. But what we're actually looking at really is a soothsayer, hence the wonderful soothsayer from the wonderful Asterix comic. And I kind of want to pile into these laws about soothsayers to ask a couple of relatively specific questions. Broadly looking at this laws around the soothsayer, you know, what are the social roles that we can see? And is there any way that we can take the social roles that we see in laws from a gaming perspective and think about making characters? Because I think that's always a useful way to analyze a law. Relevant to the conference today, this weekend, how is an outcast, you know, how is the situation of being an outcast constructed in the laws? To what extent are these people outcasts? How does that work? Again, coming back to the gaming point, you know, to what extent can we also use these laws as plot hooks? Can we go beyond just looking at individual characters and actually think about story, about making stories? And obviously underlying my work beyond analysis is also gamification, as we're here for, and how, to what extent does a law make a good story? I think people's natural response to this question should be laws, interesting stories, these belong to two different sides of the world. So hopefully I can prove that wrong through the next 9 minutes and 25 seconds. And then the final question, which I'm not really going to answer too much or address too much, but it's on my mind, is where do these people practice their craft? You know, where do you go to find a soothsayer? And the reason for that is that when James first asked me to participate in this conference, I had a very strong mental image that this law specifically said that these people were living out in the forests, out in the woodlands, away from society. I was like, perfect, outcast, margins, marginalised. And rereading the laws over the last few days when writing this, I was like, it doesn't say that. And I probably blame it on this image of the soothsayer from Asterix, which made me think of such people living in the middle of nowhere, and just let me subtly rewrite my source information. But thankfully didn't cause me the embarrassment of claiming this to be true now. At least I checked beforehand. So yes, how things go. So both of the laws found 84 and 85 are quite long, so I'm not going to go through every single detail, and that unfortunately means we're going to miss out some of the really good stuff. But I hope I've picked some equally good parts. So this is how the law begins, translated into English with some updates to correct a couple of translation issues, but based on Catherine Fisher-Drew's 1973 translation of the Lombard laws. So if anybody unmindful of the wrath of God goes to an areolus or areola for the purpose of receiving divinations or answers of any kind whatsoever from them, let him pay to the imperial palace, to the royal palace, as composition half of his pretium, just as it would have been valued if someone had killed him. And in addition, he shall do penance according to the established canon. Now, the pretium we normally see when talking about early medieval law as the weregild, a word that perhaps is more commonly known. Basically, in early medieval law, if you kill somebody, they have a monetary value that you have to pay to the family. It varies a little bit, and there's a lot of confusion about how it works, and this whole subject has just been reopened. But that word pretium is going to keep reappearing, and you can use it in other ways. And here we have the thing of you commit the crime of visiting this areolus or areola, and you have to pay half of the amount that you would have been valued at. So if you're a free man who owns no land, by this point, your pretium would have been about 150 solidi. And a solidus is equivalent to about just over 4 grams of gold. So, you know, it's a big price. You talk about 600 grams of gold just for going to visit a fortune teller. So, you know, it's being put as a pretty, sorry, I forgot to divide it by 2. 300 grams of gold if you're an unlanded noble person. If you own property, then yes, then it would have been up to that 600. So yeah, so it's pretty pricey. You know, it's a significant crime. Plus, also having to get the church back on your side as well and get back in their good books. But thinking about characters, obviously the two obvious ones we've got here are this areolus and areola, and the reason, apart from the fact that these are also words already used in the Roman period in classical Latin for fortune tellers, the reason that we know that the Lombards still think of them as being fortune tellers is it says so immediately afterwards in the law. You know, for the purpose of receiving divinations and aspects, you go to these people to see the future. So we have 2 incredibly interesting characters. Would they make good player characters? Maybe, but they certainly make incredibly good background, non-player character units, plot things. In tabletop role-play gaming, trying to bring in predictions of the future is notoriously difficult, but incredibly fun. So I certainly wouldn't stand against any kind of gaming situation where you bring in fortune tellers. I mean, I think it's a nice way to make the railroading seem a little bit smoother when that's the way you want to do it. You say, no, I'm not railroading you. It was a fortune. You've got to try and find your way out of it. So yeah, so they make, I think, very useful background characters. The next character that really needs to be mentioned, you don't really see them here, this if anybody. If anybody does this, this is the legal actor. This is the person who has committed the crime. In early medieval law, that anybody is not as neutral as it looks here. Normally it means a free person, and normally it specifically means a free man. We're talking about the marginalisation of women in the medieval period before. In Lombard law, there is actually a specific law saying that no woman may have legal competency, but she must always be under the legal control of some man, basically whether that's her father, her brother, her son, or if none of these people exist, then the king. So that if anybody isn't quite as open as we would like it to be. And when writing a game, that's a horrible basis to work from. I mean, it doesn't exactly make it open and inviting to say, yes, you can play this game, but you will play a free man. And working against who the laws prioritize and who they see through that perspective has been a recurring issue for me. And I hope it's becoming more open and more engaging, that, you know, even if the laws see everyone through this lens, we as players can explore the materials more openly, and perhaps that's even the benefit of gaming, that we can take it away. I am wandering off onto a very happy meandering branch, but based off of all the thoughts that have been coming to me from the previous papers rather than the ones that I promised to tell you. So I'm going to hurry on and we will pick up these in the questions. The other major character that appears here is the king. You can't see them named anywhere on here, but this is the lawgiver themselves. Kings, obviously, for a game which is set in a specific era with only one king and a named person, don't make good player characters. You need them in the background, and it's good to remember they're there. And of course, you could also point out that God is there as well, thinking as other characters. And you could say an in-person appearance may be unlikely, but it's. Again, we have the opportunity to say, do we make magic real or do we make it imaginary? Do we make the supernatural, the divine? When making games, these are questions we have to ask ourselves. And this one comes back to me continually. Do my soothsayers in-game actually predict the future, or are they charlatans? Recurring question. And in terms of analysing even that very brief little bit of plot here, through scenery and plot, we can break this down into events, into beats, into whatever you want to call them, moments that can happen in a story. We have a free person goes to a soothsayer, and then at some point afterwards they have to go to the palace to pay composition for this and then perform penance. That's already 3 clear steps, but to get between visiting the soothsayer and being accused in court of having done this and it being proven and having to go to the palace to start making amends, there are obviously other multiple steps. So beyond the law, there is reading in events that the law doesn't need to mention. The law doesn't need to talk about how you're accused, how it's proven. We have other laws that deal with that, and we have other background information, and we have a lot of guessing, to be completely and utterly honest. But that information is assumed. And from our perspective, we combine together multiple things and a bit of logic, and we sit there saying, this relatively neutral law can be broken down into a time frame, and that gives us a way to storify this and then to bring in those characters and start working things around. Right, okay, so moving on the laws, a little bit further through the first of those 2 laws I mentioned, we have a detail that if anybody, as in any free man, sends his enslaved servus or ancilla, his free man or free woman, enslaved man or enslaved woman, to go and visit the soothsayer for him, because he doesn't want to suffer all the punishment of it, so he sends one of his enslaved people. Then sending an enslaved person to do this for you is the same as doing it yourself, so you have to pay the same composition. But again, the plot thickens, hopefully literally, if you think about it in terms of story. But what happens, of course, in there. What happens, of course, if that enslaved person goes of their own accord? Now, in Roman law, you couldn't imagine that. In Roman law, anything that an enslaved person does is attributed automatically to their lord, because they have no legal competency and there's no imagination of them having any willpower or volition on legal terms. Lombards have moved away from that and can accept that enslaved people are still people and will still do things without permission. So the law starts working out what must happen here instead. And so what we have instead is that because of this terrible crime of visiting the soothsayer, rather than just paying money, the lord now has to sell them abroad, basically. And as marginalisation goes, within Lombard law, being sold outside the country is one of the rarest possible things that you see. The death penalty is far more common. Monetary fines are incredibly common, but being sold outside the country is probably one of the biggest marginalisation anathemas. They're basically saying if we can't stop people from engaging with soothsayers and other pagan practices, then we're just removing them from our presence. It's frankly, it's the equivalent of spiked benches to stop homeless people from sleeping in the middle of the town centre or areas where nice people don't want to see them. It's that kind of out of sight is out of mind atrocity. Then moving, and I realise I'm running over time, but I'm going to natter until Blair starts waving at me because I'm still going on. Moving on to the second of the two laws, we then turn our attention to legal officials. So we know what the private person and the enslaved person's role within the law is. The next one basically turns attention to find out what legal officials should be doing. And this adds us in another 4 potential character classes: the judge, who is the highest ranking local legal official within an area. Then under them, they have what's called a schuldehiss, which normally gets translated as kind of the English, early medieval English reeve, the Urefa of the Old English laws, which probably doesn't really help much for clarifying what this person does. Even by the time we get to Chaucer and the Reeve's Tale, same word, we've moved away a bit, from the kind of thing that's going on. But basically, underneath the Iudex, there is the Reeve. Each judge will have several schuldehiss underneath them. Each has their own territory that they have to work in. And each schuldehiss will have underneath them a number of saltarius and deganus. The saltarius is a forester. Their job is looking after the forested areas in the wilderness. Deganus, we don't actually know. It comes from the number 10. Does a schuldehiss have 10 of them? Is each deganus responsible for 10 people that live within a village? No idea. I even heard it argued that it shouldn't be deganus, it should be centanus, and they're actually the equivalent of the Old English 100-man. So they're in charge of 100, an area of a geographical area. But the whole thing is that these people have a duty to investigate these claims of there being an areolus or areola. Is that a way for me to stop, Blair?
If you could wrap it up, yes.
I will hurry up. Okay, so moving very quickly. Yeah, so it's their job to interfere, and to encourage them to do this, they get some of the sale price from the people which are being sold abroad. Because the law also says that if an areolus or an areola refuses, oh no, I've jumped ahead of myself. Ignore that. Yeah, so they have to swear that they will uphold this duty, that they won't avoid it. They have 3 months to do it. They have to pay fines if they don't do it. All of the bits of the law basically come together to create a storifiable, gamifiable situation. And the laws actually basically, if you analyze them with gaming in mind, include fail conditions and win conditions, basically depending on how it works. And so what I really want to conclude here is that these laws offer multi-level ways of thinking about for gamification, from individual characters, whether they're player characters and non-player characters, to overarching ideas for scenarios. And although I didn't talk about it too much today, you can even see through these laws into fundamental concerns for game mechanics. Can we see outcasts? Yes. The areolus and the areola, like enslaved people who visit them, will be sold outside the province. Becoming a criminal puts you temporarily outside the law, but these people are at the very pointy end of legal retribution. This is the whole bit about them being the areolus and the areola being sold abroad as well, which I kind of jumped the gun on that one. But anyway, yeah, so that's me finished. Apologies for running over. And any questions? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we should all just briefly thank the speakers for their really wonderful and engaging presentations. And then we can open the floor to any questions if anyone's got any. I know I have a few, but